Hello everyone. Today's lecture brings us into a field that is both conceptually rich and highly practical: strategic management of regions and municipalities. This is a topic that sits at the intersection of geography, economics, public administration, and planning. And what makes it particularly interesting is that it forces us to think across scales, from small municipalities all the way to supranational systems. What I would like to do today is not simply define concepts, but guide you through a way of thinking about space, because regions are not just lines on a map, they are living systems shaped by relationships, flows, decisions, and history. So, let us begin with the most fundamental question. 1. What is a region? Understanding the concept. When we use the word region, it may sound straightforward, but in reality, it is one of the most complex and debated concepts in spatial sciences. At its core, regional development as a discipline examines how different areas evolve in terms of economic activity, social structures, political organization, and spatial relationships. But the challenge begins when we try to define what exactly a region is. A region can be understood in several different ways. First, it can be seen as the result of a process we call regionalization. This means that a region is not something that simply exists naturally. It is often constructed. We define it based on certain criteria such as economic activity, population density, or natural features. In this sense, a region is an abstraction, a way of organizing reality so we can better understand it. Second, a region can be a practical unit of governance. This is perhaps the most familiar interpretation. Regions become spaces where policies are implemented, where decisions about development, infrastructure, or public services are made. Third, a region can act as a platform for cooperation. Municipalities often come together to form associations or microregions in order to coordinate development strategies, share resources, or solve common problems. Fourth, and this is very important, a region is also a product of relationships. It is defined by flows of people, goods, information, and capital. These interactions create dynamic systems that evolve over time. And finally, a region can be understood as a complex differentiation of space, where different parts of the countryside develop distinct characteristics based on historical and socio-economic processes. Now, if this sounds slightly confusing, that's because it is. There is no single definition that captures all aspects. But a useful way to think about it is this. A region is a dynamic spatial system shaped by interactions between natural conditions and human activity, with a certain level of internal organization that distinguishes it from other areas. Let's now take a look at historical perspective. Interestingly, the term region is not new. It comes from Latin regio, which referred to an area under the control of a ruler. So originally, a region was about power and territory. Over time, this understanding evolved. By the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars began to develop different approaches. The deterministic approach emphasized the role of nature, suggesting that geography determines economic and social development. The possibilistic approach introduced more complexity, arguing that human choices interact with natural conditions. The indeterministic approach went further, suggesting that social systems can develop independently of nature. And the postmodern approach sees regions as social constructs shaped by perception, culture, and political discourse. Each of these perspectives adds something valuable. Together, they remind us that regions are not fixed, they are interpreted. So, why do we study regions? Let me offer you a practical reason. If you want to manage development effectively, you cannot treat a country as a uniform space. Different areas behave differently. They respond differently to policies, investments, and crises. Regions help us break down complexity. They act like pieces of a puzzle, allowing us to analyze parts of a larger whole. They can serve as examples, as anomalies, or as comparisons. And importantly, they act as modulators of development. A region with a strong service sector may respond differently to an economic crisis than one dependent on heavy industry. Let's see on some examples. In the Czech Republic, regions such as South Moravia illustrate strong agricultural and industrial interactions, while Prague functions as a dominant metropolitan core with very different dynamics. Another example is from Slovakia. The contrast between the Bratislava region and eastern regions highlights disparities in economic development and spatial integration. Or, for instance, in far African country Ghana, the Greater Accra region represents a rapidly urbanizing economic hub, while northern regions face different developmental challenges tied to infrastructure and climate. Now that we understand what a region is, the next step is to understand how regions are classified, because not all regions are the same, and classification helps us organize this diversity. First is an industrial criterion. One of the simplest ways to classify regions is based on their dominant economic activity. For example, we may call them as industrial regions, or agricultural regions, or service-oriented regions, but in geography we often distinguish between physical geographical regions, socio-economic regions, or complex regions that combine both of them. The challenge is that real regions are rarely purely one type. Second characterization is administrative versus specific purpose regions. The matter is that, from a practical standpoint, regions can also be administrative regions that are created for governance and specific purpose regions created to solve particular problems. Thus, administrative regions are stable and hierarchical, while specific purpose regions are flexible and often temporary. Third classification criterion is economic development. Regions can also be categorized based on their level of development, such as growing regions, which are dynamic with expanding economies, stagnating regions, stable but not progressing, and problematic regions, those which are facing structural challenges. Fourth classification is by a methodological perspective. Here we ask, why are we defining this region? The answers are as a research tool, as an object of study, as a planning unit. Fifth is a taxonomic criterion. This distinguishes between individual regions, which are unique, named areas, typological regions, groups of areas with similar characteristics, and the last one is a form criterion. Here we look at structure, homogeneous regions, those which are internally similar, while heterogeneous or nodal regions, defined by relationships, and planning regions created for policy purposes, so-called nodal regions, are especially important as they revolve around a core, such as a city, with surrounding areas connected through flows like commuting. Let's take a look at the example of the Czech Republic. One of the ways to identify problematic regions here is to find the Act number 248/2000 call on the support of regional development. This act identified four basic types of regions based on the support needed: structurally deficient regions, economically weak regions, rural regions, and other problematic regions. Currently, this classification has been modified and only three categories are identified: structurally deficient regions, economically weak regions, and regions with high unemployment rate. Their current location, dated in February of 2010, can be seen in this figure. Source is the Ministry of Regional Development. Now let's move to hierarchy. Regions do not exist at one level. They are part of a system. Think of it like an organization. So there are two interrelated principles. Small units form larger ones, and larger units influence smaller ones. There are also key characteristics. First, higher level regions are larger and change more slowly. Second, instability at higher levels affects lower levels. And third, influence decreases as we move down the hierarchy. At the socioeconomic levels, we can identify levels such as sub-regional, local interactions, micro-regional, daily commuting areas, meso-regional, regional service centers, macro-regional, national cores, national, supranational, global, and European context. Next system. By the way, in the European Union, regions are classified using the NECT system, where NECTs 1 are large regions, NECTs 2 are key for funding, NECTs 3 are smaller administrative units. This allows comparison and allocation of development funds. For example, in the Czech Republic, Prague functions at macro-regional and national levels, while smaller towns operate at micro-regional levels and funded with much lower rate. In Slovakia, for instance, Bratislava dominates higher levels, while second largest city there, Košice, serves as meso-regional center. Let us now move into a part of the lecture that is slightly more methodological but absolutely essential if we want to understand how regions are actually constructed in practice. Up to this point, we have discussed what regions are, how they differ, and how they are organized hierarchically. But now we must ask a more technical question. How do we actually define regions in a systematic and scientifically meaningful way? This is where the concept of regional taxonomy comes in. Regional taxonomy is in essence a structured process of dividing space into meaningful units based on selected criteria. It is not random, it is not arbitrary, it is a carefully designed analytical procedure that allows us to transform complex, continuous space into understandable and manageable regions. Now, there are two fundamental ways to approach this process. The first is deductive. In this approach, we start from a larger whole and divide it into smaller parts. For example, we may take a country and divide it into regions, then into districts, and then into municipalities. This is a top-down approach, often used in administrative systems and widely used especially in classical and Keynesian theories of economics. The second, as you already know, is inductive. Here, we move in the opposite direction. We begin with small units, villages, towns, or local areas, and group them together based on similarity or interaction. This is a bottom-up approach, often used in analytical and planning contexts, and intensively used as a methodological approach in an institutional school of economics. In reality, most regionalization processes combine both approaches. We define regions partly based on existing administrative structures and partly based on observed spatial relationships. Within regional taxonomy, it is important to distinguish between two closely related but fundamentally different processes: regionalization and regional typology. Regionalization is the process of defining specific individual regions. It answers the question, where are the boundaries? The result is a map divided into clearly defined areas, regions that cover the entire territory without overlapping. While regional typology, on the other hand, does not focus on boundaries but on similarities. It groups different areas into categories based on shared characteristics. These categories may include, for example, industrial regions, rural regions, or regions with high unemployment. And here is a key insight. Typological regions do not necessarily have to be spatially continuous with a joint border. Two regions on opposite sides of a country, or even in different countries, can belong to the same typological category. Now, let's ask, what are the characteristics of well-defined regions? Now, if we are to define regions properly, there are certain criteria we should always keep in mind. And a well-defined region should be, first, internally coherent. The selected characteristics should be relatively uniform within the region. Second, externally distinct. The region should differ clearly from neighboring regions. Third, sufficiently large. It means to be not too small to be insignificant, but not too large to lose meaning. Fourth, hierarchically compatible. It should fit into a broader system of regions. And one more additional point for nodal regions, those based on interactions, there is an additional requirement. Internal relationships should be stronger than external ones. Speaking about forms of regional taxonomy, it can take different forms where we can distinguish between non-hierarchical taxonomy, where regions are defined at a single level, and hierarchical taxonomy, where regions are organized into multiple levels. We can also distinguish between formal taxonomy, used for homogeneous regions, and functional taxonomy, used for nodal regions. This distinction is important because it reflects two different ways of thinking about space, one based on similarity, the other based on interaction. Now that we understand the principles, the next logical question is, how do we actually perform regional taxonomy in practice? And there is no single method. In fact, a wide range of techniques exists, each with its own strengths and limitations. What is important is to select the method that best fits the objective of the analysis. So, further, there are a list of recognized methods. First is a cartographic method. Let's begin with one of the oldest and most intuitive approaches, the cartographic method. This method involves working with maps. Different phenomena, such as industry, population, or land use, are mapped separately. These maps are then overlaid to identify patterns and relationships. For example, one map might show agricultural production, while another shows population density. By combining them, we may identify agricultural regions with high labor intensity. This method is visually intuitive, but it can become complex when multiple layers are involved. Second method is leading factor method. Here, instead of considering many variables, we select one or two key factors that best represent the phenomenon we are studying. For instance, if we are interested in economic structure, we might focus on employment by sector. If we are studying urban influence, we might focus on commuting flows. This method simplifies analysis, but it also risks oversimplification if important factors are ignored. Third method. This involves simplifying complex data by focusing on the most important elements and ignoring less significant details. The goal is to create regions that are as internally homogeneous as possible. This method requires experience and judgment, because deciding what to include and what to exclude is not always straightforward. Fourth method is border analysis method. Now, let's consider a more analytical approach, the border analysis method. This is particularly useful in inductive regionalization. Here, we examine the boundaries between spatial units such as municipalities and analyze how different they are in terms of selected criteria. Units that are similar are grouped together, while significant differences define boundaries. For example, if two neighboring districts have very different unemployment rates, this may indicate a regional boundary. Fifth method is a quantitative method. In modern regional science, quantitative methods play an increasingly important role. These methods use statistical and mathematical tools to identify patterns and relationships. Herein, one of the most important techniques is cluster analysis. Cluster analysis groups spatial units into clusters based on similarity across multiple variables. For example, we might group regions based on GDP, employment, education, and infrastructure. The result is a set of clusters, where units within each group are more similar to each other than to those in other groups. Different clustering methods exist, such as single linkage, complete linkage, centroid methods, and Ward's method, each producing slightly different results. Another important set of tools includes factor analysis, correlation analysis, and distance analysis in multidimensional space. These methods allow us to move beyond intuition and base regionalization on empirical data. Of course, there are also more specialized techniques. Theas and polygons, for example, divide space into areas based on proximity to specific points, such as service centers. Or graph theory allows us to analyze networks, transportation systems, communication flows, or economic linkages. Also, commuting analysis is widely used to define functional or nodal regions, identifying areas that are economically connected to a central city. Let me conclude this part of the lecture with a broader reflection. Regional taxonomy and its methods may seem technical, even abstract, but their implications are very real. The way we define regions influences the following: how resources are distributed, how policies are designed, how inequalities are addressed. If we define regions poorly, we risk misunderstanding reality. We may group together areas that have little in common, or separate areas that are deeply interconnected. But if we define regions carefully, based on sound methodology and clear objectives, we gain a powerful tool for strategic management. And this brings us back to the central idea of today's lecture. Regions are not just spaces, they are systems, they are relationships. They are dynamic structures that require thoughtful analysis and responsible management. Thank you for your attention.